Good morning. Good morning. Thanks for the invitation for having me as part of this great conference. I'm honored and pleased to be here. Unfortunately, it's the middle of the night in Boston, so I've recorded my talk because I think that you deserve a talk by someone who is well awake and not half asleep. This means that I won't be able to take comments and questions after the talk, but I very much welcome your thoughts and questions and comments. So please feel free to reach out by email to rtallarita at law.harvard.edu. Okay, so the title of the conference is about la creación de valor económico y social. And I will focus on the second part, on la creación de valor social, and in particular on the role of institutional investors in the creation of social value. Let me share a few slides so I can. Okay, I hope you can see it. One important recent phenomenon in this space is that large institutional investors have been focusing on environmental and social issues in their investment decisions and in their stewardship activities. I don't like the label ESG, which, as we know, stands for environmental, social, and governance, but everyone uses it, so I will use ESG for simplicity to indicate environmental and social issues. So ESG stewardship is when institutional investors engage with portfolio companies on social environmental issues, on ESG issues. Let's take a look, for example, at the BlackRock Stewardship Reports. This is the first page of the most recent BlackRock report. BlackRock, as you know, is the largest asset manager in the world with about $10 trillion of assets under management. And they publish an annual report like this about all kinds of stewardship activities, including ESG stewardship. And last year, in 2022, so BlackRock had almost 4,000 engagements, 4,000 meetings, or conference calls, or Zoom chats with companies, with more than 2,500 portfolio companies, to push these companies towards some kind of best practices in the ESG space. And we call this ESG stewardship. Okay, so now what kind of things BlackRock wants companies to do? Sustainability reports, sustainability disclosures, sustainability practices, committees, climate risk management, more gender and racial diversity in the board of directors or in senior management, and so on and so forth. So why do we care about this from the point of view of society, right? We care because the theory is that these institutions can create social value. They can accomplish something good for society. For example, they can push large corporations to reduce carbon emissions. This is a central problem for business law. It's the problem that in economic jargon we call the problem of externalities. Corporations and capitalism have created enormous wealth and social benefits, but they also produce social costs. They impose social costs on others, on third parties. Climate change is one of them. We call these negative externalities. There is a broad scientific consensus, for example, on climate, that the high concentration of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere may have catastrophic consequences for our societies. And this is in part the product of industrial emissions. But if we all agree that we would collectively be better off with much fewer emissions, why don't we just collectively decide to emit less, right? It looks simple, but it's not. It's a deep philosophical and economic puzzle, which we call the problem of externalities. So traditionally, supporters and critics of free market capitalism have embraced two different views of externalities. Free market enthusiasts have argued that the market can provide a solution to the problem of social cost. They believe that whatever injury economic activity causes, market transactions can often find an acceptable cure. By contrast, critics of unbridled capitalism have been skeptical of using market solutions to fix market problems. When markets fail, they argue, it's the government that can and must provide an answer. So this is, of course, a very crude simplification of a very rich and deep intellectual debate, but it tracks two generally accurate dispositions towards the problem of externalities. Each of these two views has its own intellectual champion. Arthur Pigou for the government camp and Ronald Coase for the market camp. Again, this is a simplification, a rough simplification. I'm sure many of you familiar with Coase and Pigou are thinking, well, it's not that simple, right? You know, Coase has written also this and this, and Pigou has also said this and this. But, and that's true, this is a rough simplification, but it's, I think, interesting to try to understand what's going on right now with ESG stewardship. So Arthur Pigou in 1920 offered the first analytical treatment of the problem of externalities and established what would become the mainstream economic approach. When private activity creates a social cost, we should tax or regulate that activity. Ronald Coase, writing 4 decades later, proposed a radical alternative. He argued that what we call an externality is often only a reciprocal conflict of interest, of private interests, that can be fixed through a private transaction, at least when transaction costs are sufficiently low. So it's much more complicated than this, as I said, of course. Coase and Pigou were very nuanced thinkers. But this simplification is not too far from reality. And given that these two contrasting approaches to market and government, it is no surprise that market enthusiasts are often Coasians, while progressives are often Pigovians. But here's the plot twist. In the last few years, supporters of progressive causes have been increasingly looking at markets-based solutions to tackle major externalities, ESG stewardship. So how does exactly ESG stewardship fit in these two camps? The basic idea of ESG stewardship is the following. Big corporations are the main culprits for climate change. I'll make the example of climate change because it's probably the most important, both in theory and in practice. So big corporations are the main culprits for climate change. The stock of big corporations is primarily in the hands of large institutional investors. Ergo, large institutional investors can persuade big corporations to cut their carbon emissions and thus fight climate change. why would they do that? Okay. So one version of the story is that mitigating climate change is good for the bottom line of those big corporations, for their profits, for their shareholder value. Climate change threatens to damage production facilities, for example, supply chain, workers' productivity, and therefore, ultimately, companies' profits. So companies have an economic incentive to do something about climate change. But this story sounds over-optimistic to me, right? If it were true, why do we have the emissions problem in the first place? Companies would do something about this, and we wouldn't need ESG stewardship. We wouldn't need institutional investors to pressure companies to reduce carbon emissions. So another version of the story, much more sophisticated, much more intriguing, which I call portfolio primacy. Some other authors call systematic stewardship, universal ownership, stewardship, and other labels, is that reducing externalities, and in this particular case, reducing carbon footprint, climate externalities, it is good for the investor portfolio as a whole, even if it's not good for some individual companies. So big institutional investors hold diversified portfolios. It means that they own a stock across many industries and countries. They own stock in Exxon, which produces a lot of carbon emissions, but they also own stock in Hilton hotels, whose seaside resorts are going to lose a ton of value due to climate change. So even if cutting emissions doesn't make sense for Exxon, it does make sense for Hilton, and it does make sense for the investor portfolio in the aggregate. Okay, so does it work? I don't think so. And I think this theory is over-optimistic. We shouldn't expect big institutions like BlackRock and others to make a significant impact on climate change. I talk about this in my article, The Limits of Portfolio Primacy, which has been published in the Vanderbilt Law Review. And if you read it, I hope you like it, and I'm happy to talk about this further. However, today I don't want to focus on this. I want to focus on a different aspect. And the question is, how exactly did supporters of progressive causes end up putting their faith in the logic of financial capital and the power of the stock market? Okay, so remember, the traditional camps are cautions pro-market, and they're typically libertarian, classical liberals who believe in the power of the market and are very skeptical of governments and government interventions. And Pigovians, who are more optimistic about government intervention, and they believe that it's the government job and it's desirable for the government to step in and take care of externalities. So this ESG stewardship looks like a strange animal because it advocates progressive causes, reduction of carbon emissions, curbing of social cost of business, but by means of market-based solutions like institutional investors and stock market, capital markets mechanisms. So I don't have the time to get into the details of the project I'm working on, but I will give you a quick overview of how portfolio primacy is different, in my view, from both the Gaussian and the Pigovian approaches. It's not just a market-based Gaussian solution applied to progressive causes, and it's not a Pigovian solution. It's something different, and if you want to think about it and understand its promise and its dangers, I think we should pay attention to these differences. So one important difference is this. Gaussians advocate private, decentralized solutions. Pigovians are for public, centralized solutions, governments. But portfolio primacy advocates are for private, centralized solutions. So this is one important difference. We have a hybrid between centralized solutions, which are typically government-led solutions, and private solutions. But there is another important difference, I believe. Under the cause theorem, the solution to the problem of externalities come from a market transaction. Two parties or more, two or more separate parties bargain with each other and find a mutually satisfactory solution that cures the problem of externalities. Under the Pigovian paradigm, it's the government that steps in and uses its public power to impose taxes, typically, on the company. It's not a market transaction. It's just public exercise of public power. But ESG stewardship is different. ESG stewardship, and in particular portfolio primacy, is based on ownership. The institutional investors are not bargaining with the company. They are exercising their ownership rights as shareholders. If they want, they can just fire the management, right? They don't need to negotiate with the company. This is a very important difference because it is something that neither Gaussians nor Pigovians propose. Actually, if you read my paper when it's ready, I'll show that Ronald Coase writes something about ownership as a solution to the problem of externalities in his 1960 paper. But he's thinking, of course, about something different from this. There's no ESG stewardship in 1960. So again, I do not have time to develop my analysis here because listening to a video, I'm sure, is very boring for you. And I want to be quick. It's boring for you. And it's complicated for me because I'm talking to a computer and I don't even know if my jokes are good because I don't know if you're laughing. So, okay. So let's see how these three solutions work and why. And then I'll say a few words about one important dimension of how they differ from one another, and then I'll stop. So this is the externality problem. Okay, let's take an example, a very simple stylized externality problem, a CO2 pollution, climate change problem. So we have company A, which is engaged in some project that creates $100 million of profits for its shareholder S. But it also creates 130 million losses for companies B, C, and D due to CO2 emissions. These are pollution losses, or you can think of them as climate change damages. They are negative externalities suffered by B, C, and D. So how do we fix this? Let's start from Pigo. So the Pigovian solution is that the government steps in and imposes a 130 million tax on company A. Then what happens? Well, if company A makes 100 million of profits and must pay 130 million of taxes, the project doesn't make sense financially, economically, doesn't make sense economically anymore. So company A will abandon the project. The externality problem is solved. What's the caution solution? So the caution solution is the following. Cause says, well, it is company A that must suffer. Why? It's not clear, right? This is a bilateral problem. Company A wants to make a profit, and companies B, C, and D want to avoid the carbon emissions, the costs related to the carbon emissions. So they can negotiate and find a solution. For example, company B, C, and D can pay 100 million to company A to abandon the project. In this case, company A still makes 100 million profit anyway. And company B, C, and D save 30 million because they pay 100 but avoid 130 of losses. So it's a good deal for everyone. They will sign the deal. The externality problem is solved. What's the portfolio primacy approach? What's the ESG stewardship portfolio primacy approach? Well, it's very different. The idea is that shareholder S is not just a shareholder of company A, but is also an investor in company B, C, and D. So shareholder S internalizes not only the 100 million profit, but also the 130 million loss. So for shareholder S, this is a bad project because it results in a net loss of $30 million. It's good for A, but it's not good for the shareholder. So shareholder S will exercise its rights and influence as a shareholder of company A to push company A to abandon the project. The externality problem is solved. So 3 very different ways to solve the externality problem. But let's focus on portfolio primacy. It raises many interesting problems, right? The first problem is it true? I mean, it's nice. In the stylized example, it works very nice, right? But of course, the real world is much more complicated. So the first question is, does it work economically? As I said, I'm skeptical, and I discussed this in the Vanderbilt Law Review paper, The Limits of Portfolio Primacy. Another interesting problem is it legal? Can this really happen? Can shareholder S push company A to abandon a profitable project for the benefit of other companies? Well, it's not so simple, okay? So I discussed this in a new essay that is forthcoming in the online edition of the University of Pennsylvania Law Review, which is called Fiduciary Deadlock. It's on SSRN. I welcome comments and input on the current draft. But there's another interesting question, which I'm working on right now, and I will give you only one slide about what I think about it to conclude this talk. And the question is, how does this solution, portfolio primacy, compare to the other two from a social point of view? Assuming that it works economically, which is not really true in my opinion, but many people think that I'm too pessimistic about ESG, and maybe they're right, okay? So assuming that it works economically, assuming that it works legally, which again is not really true, okay? But some people disagree. How does it compare to the Pigovian and Cohen solution as a solution to the problem of externality from a social standpoint, from a policy standpoint. So I leave you with just a couple of thoughts on this. So let's first look at one very important limit that all three approaches face. I call it the curse of size. When the externality problem involves a very large number of people, fixing it is much, much harder. Climate change is a global problem. It involves every human being in the world. So the curse of size is a big problem for Pigovians, for Cohens, and for ESG supporters. Let's see why. The Cohen approach works best when transactions costs are low. If companies A, B, C, and D, in my example, want to negotiate, they must spend some money, right? They have to set up meetings, hire lawyers, etc. But since B, C, and D can save 30 million with that kind of arrangements, even if they pay $500,000 to lawyers and $500,000 of management time, it still makes sense economically to make the deal. But when it comes to climate change, it's not possible for the entire human race to negotiate with all the major carbon emitters. Not possible. One possible system is that some governments are experimenting with is to put a cap on emissions and then create a market to trade permits and credits. So the government represents the people by setting some limits, and then the companies can trade permits on the market. It's a hybrid Pigovian Cohen system with a strong market element. It's promising, but a full Cohen solution is not possible because of the huge size of the problem here. So the Pigovian model has a size problem too, because we do not have a single world government that can tax all world CO2 emitters. So we have dozens of different governments, and they have conflicts of interest. Why the US should tax its own companies if China doesn't tax its own companies. And therefore, we have a free riding problem, and we are stuck. Also, governments are not always very effective, right? And they are not always very competent. And the bigger the problem to solve, the less effective governments are likely to be. So the Pigovian model has a size problem too. But there is a but. And I mean, let me just say something about the portfolio primacy model. The portfolio primacy model, of course, and I discussed this at length in my portfolio primacy paper. There are private companies, and large institutional investors can do very little stewardship on private companies. There are foreign companies, okay? China companies are not going to listen to BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and other institutional investors. There are control companies, not just state-controlled companies like in China, but many companies with controlling shareholders in Europe, especially. And controlling shareholders are like shareholder S of the traditional scheme. They're not largely diversified. They are disproportionately exposed to their controlled company, so they don't really benefit from punishing their own company for the benefits of the market as a whole. There are small firms There are individual losses that are not captured by the stock market. So for a number of reasons, the size of the problem is a big limit for the portfolio primacy approach as well. But we can try to improve things, okay? For example, we can design markets for CO2 emissions, as I said before, to facilitate transactions, to facilitate negotiations with reduced transaction costs. We can vote for better politicians, more competent politicians. We can vote for politicians who care about global issues and not just domestic issues. I mean, it's difficult, right? But we can make some improvements. For example, I'll give you a US example. A few days ago, the Biden administration issued a new regulation about cost-benefit analysis. And the new regulation is much more sensitive to global climate externalities than it was the old regulation. So governments can do better. We can design, we can tweak public institutions in a better way. We can make better choices. It is difficult. We will not succeed completely, but we can improve on a number of dimensions and we can reduce the curse of size. But what about portfolio primacy? Portfolio primacy, we can make improvements as well, right? But the improved Pigovian solutions looks great. More competent governments, more enlightened and effective governments. That sounds great, right? The improved cohesion solution looks great too. Lower transaction costs, more socially beneficial private transaction, that's great. But in the improved portfolio primacy solution looks problematic. Institutional investors, to improve the effectiveness of portfolio primacy, we need institutional investors that own an even larger share of the economy in both developed and developing economies, both in public markets and in private markets, both in Europe, in the United States, and in China, India, Africa. If BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and others owned more, they would care more about climate change and other global externalities. But is this scenario where a handful of financial managers own the global economy a desirable utopia, like the perfect, competent, enlightened government, or rather an unsettling dystopia? This is a very important question, and we should pay attention to it, because this is a crucial difference between these three systems. Improving the cohesion model is difficult, but it sounds good. Improving the Pigovian model is difficult, but it sounds good. Improving the portfolio primacy model, does it sound good? I'll stop here. Thanks again for inviting me. Feel free to reach out with comments and questions by email. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the conference, and I hope to see you in person next time in Madrid, here in Cambridge, or elsewhere. Thank you very much.